Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve BERG. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Today's topic is radical candor. Quite often these days, obfuscation and insincerity in communications from our business leaders and politicians are the norm. Entrepreneurs and founders that provide their employees the ability to operate with an understanding of where they stand in an organization and what is expected of them through open and honest communication is a huge service. It takes a lot of time and energy to think and analyze and communicate in a candid way. But making the effort makes the difference. The reason I point this out is because I've been studying some of the work of our guest today. Kim Scott is the author of the book Radical Candor. Kim also is the co-founder and CEO of Candor Inc., which builds tools to make it easier to follow the advice she offers in her book. Prior to founding Candor Inc., Kim was CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and several other companies in Silicon Valley. Hi, Kim. Thanks for coming on.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having us. And don't forget about our podcast, Radical Candor, also.
Perfect. Yes. I'm glad you brought it up.
Cool.
First, let me say that you're so much more interesting than my introduction suggests. Could you start by taking a second to to fill in the blanks for people that may not know your history?
Sure. Let me just say, Steve, that flattery will get you everywhere, despite despite my radical candor philosophy. So I started my career actually in Russia. I studied Russian literature, and that was where I really learned about how important it is to give a damn in order to be a good capitalist. I was trying to hire a bunch of Russian diamond cutters, and I thought I just had to pay them more, which was easy. And it turned out they didn't want just money. They actually wanted to know that I gave a damn about them at a human level, that I would get their families out of Russia if everything went to hell. So that it was a funny place to begin life in business.
That is not what I expected. This is new stuff for me, so that's great. Let's create a baseline and define radical candor. It's not merely openness and honesty, is it?
No, not at all. In fact, I worked really hard not to call it honesty. Not that I have anything against the truth, but there's not a lot of humility in the truth. So the reason why I call it radical candor, the reason why I call it radical is that it's very rare. And the reason why I call it candor is that it's really just about saying, here's what I think. What do you think? Candor for me implies a lot of reciprocity. And at its core, radical candor is something that seems very simple. So it's strange that it should be so rare. It's the ability to care personally about somebody at the same time that you challenge them directly. And I think it's rare that we're able to do that. And it's hard for two reasons. One reason is that from the time we get our first job, we're 18, 19 years old, and we're right at that moment in our lives when our sort of personas are beginning to solidify, but our egos are still quite fragile. And right at that moment, we're told, be professional. And for an awful lot of people, that gets translated to mean leave your emotions, leave your humanity, leave the very best part of yourself at home and come to work as something less than fully human. And that is a disaster for radical candor. And yet, I think all of us have experienced some version of that. And then on the challenge directly dimension of radical candor, this is in many ways the willingness to piss people off. And it hardly seems worth asking why we're unwilling to piss each other off, right? We're social animals and that feels risky. But I think the problem there begins actually when we're 18 months old. Around the time we learn to speak, our parents start to tell us some version of, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. And now all of a sudden, when you become a leader, or just when you go to work and you become a colleague, it's your job to say it. So undoing that training that's been pounded into your head since you learned to speak literally is hard.
So you started to touch on this, but if I, just as a person or as a leader, and I'm deciding I'm going to practice radical candor, what kind of things do I actually do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the most important thing about radical candor is don't dish it out until you prove you can take it. And this is true whether you're the boss or the employee or the peer. So start by soliciting feedback, by asking people, what you could do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with you. Now, if those words don't fall trippingly off your tongue, and they may not, come up with a different way to ask it. A friend of mine, Krista Quarles, who's the CEO of OpenTable, likes to ask, tell me why I'm smoking crack. So if that's easier for you to say than tell me what I could do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me, fine. Just come up with a way that you can imagine asking for the feedback. Now, once you've asked for it, it's very tempting to think your next step is to make the other person comfortable. But Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel, actually explained to me this is exactly wrong. And he was quite well known for getting people to say exactly what they thought to him, and also for being willing to say exactly what he thought. And the reason why he said it was exactly wrong to try to make them comfortable is because the only thing that's going to make people comfortable is to tell you nothing. And so you have to embrace the discomfort. You have to be willing to make it harder for them to tell you nothing than for them to tell you something. And a very simple way to do this is to simply close your mouth and count to 6 in your head, right? Almost nobody can endure 6 seconds of silence. They'll step in and they'll tell you something.
So there's this Harvard ethicist, his name is Louis Skennon, and he says that intellectual honesty is the disposition to eschew deception when given an incentive for deception. And I think this is what you're touching on. Isn't the potential unpleasantness of simply telling someone an unwelcome truth to their face, that's enough of an incentive for deception to say nothing?
Yes, exactly. And so it's your job when you're soliciting feedback to help somebody over that hurdle. And sometimes the best way to help them is by embracing the discomfort and by embracing the uncomfortable situation that you just put that person in. And the simplest way to do that, of course, is just to shut your mouth and be silent. However, sometimes it takes more than that. For example, in Japan, when Toyota was really focused on continuous improvement, they were struggling with a culture that made people extremely reluctant to criticize authority. And so what Toyota did was ingenious. They painted a big red box at the end of the assembly line, and they made people stand in the box, and you weren't allowed to leave the box until you had criticized 3 things you saw on the line that week. And so that was an extreme version of embracing the discomfort. I never quite had the courage to draw a red box next to my desk, but come up with something that will really put people on the spot and make them tell you something. So that's sort of, if step number 1 is come up with a question that you can ask. Step number 2 is embrace the discomfort. Step number 3 is listen. Now that you've dragged someone out on a conversational limb they didn't want to be on, listen with the intent to understand, not to respond. It's just vital that you don't get defensive when you finally do get some criticism, but it's also totally normal and natural to feel defensive. So you've got to manage yourself in this case. You're not managing the other person. If you're managing yourself, you're batting above average. So figure out a way not to get defensive. And then the 4th and final important thing that you can do to solicit feedback is to reward the candor. Now, rewarding the candor is pretty easy if you agree with the feedback. You fix the problem and you tell the person that you fixed the problem, and you do it as publicly and loudly as possible. However, if you disagree with the feedback, it can be a little bit more difficult. And in that case, what I recommend is find some part of what the person said that you can agree with and focus on that first, and then say, but I want to think more about what you've said and I want to come back to you. And it's really important that you do come back. And then when you do, the thing to say is really pretty simple. It's, I appreciate the feedback. I'm not sure I agree with it. Can I give you a fuller explanation of why? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Like at least at the beginning, go halvesies a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe not halvesies. Maybe you only agree with 5% of what was said. Just focus on that at first. And then say, I'm going to come back and explain why I disagree. Now, at some point you have to, you can't argue endlessly. You've got to come up with a way of of making a decision, of moving forward, even if you don't agree. But at least now you disagree.
Right. So you're right. So once again, you're being candid. Everybody understands where they are, which is just helpful because then you can operate it from a kind of a more organic place, right? Instead of tiptoeing around.
Yes, exactly. There was one journalist who wrote about radical candor who sort of interpreted it, understandably, as a thank you, sir, may I have another? Like you had to just accept all feedback. And that's, of course, not what I believe, because sometimes you're going to get feedback that you disagree with or that's just plain wrong. But you do have to manage your defensiveness. And there's a difference. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. I've got another quote for you, and I promise this is the last one. This is Walt Whitman, and he's quoted as saying, "All faults may be forgiven to him who has perfect candor." And I think the implication is that candor is, I think he's saying it's among the most important qualities for leaders. And yes. I think you've mentioned kind of, I'm sure you were paraphrasing Walt, that candor is an atomic building block for management.
Yes.
So just some thoughts on that would be great.
So it's so important, both frankly as a leader and a follower, as a leader and an employee, and really we're all leaders in some way, shape, or form. It's so important to share what you really think, because we all make mistakes, and we're usually unable as human beings to know in the moment when we're making a mistake. We rely on other people to tell us. And if you don't tell somebody when they're making a mistake, or also when they're doing something fantastic, then you're not helping them grow, and you're not helping the team achieve what it could achieve. So you're hurting both the individual and the collective by not speaking up. And even if you're wrong, it's valuable to speak up. One of the cultures I really admire is McKinsey. McKinsey has this notion. I spent 10 weeks at McKinsey this summer between my 2 years in business school. And they have this notion of the obligation to dissent. And it was really empowering. The notion was that even if you were the summer intern, if you disagreed with something that a partner said, you were obligated. It wasn't just you were allowed, you were obligated to say something. And I think it was a big part of what made McKinsey a great place to work.
So I want to break down radical candor a little bit. When I was an investor, or I guess I am an investor, I think about the elements that I'm looking for in a founder. And that list typically will include intellectual honesty and transparency. It will include self-awareness. It will include communications, the ability to accept criticism, the ability to give constructive criticism, humbleness, a number of things that you've touched on already. When I think about those things that I'm looking for, I think to myself, well, wait a minute, that's the list of elements that make up radical candor.
Yes. Don't forget about caring personally, though. Otherwise, you wind up with too much obnoxious aggression. in a culture. And the problem with obnoxious aggression, which is what I call what happens when somebody does challenge directly but fails to show they care personally, is that you wind up engaging the lizard brain and making it really hard for other people to hear what you're saying. And you also don't build, you don't wind up with the same kinds of results, because you aren't, if you're not showing the people that you work with that you care about them at a human level, you wind up not getting the best efforts out of people because you're not helping them grow in the right way. A big part of, and you're not understanding what gives work meaning for each individual. Again, your role as a leader is not to provide purpose, because everybody finds purpose and meaning in their work in different ways. Your role as a leader is to understand how each individual who works directly for you derives purpose and meaning from their work, and to make sure you're giving them the right kinds of work and putting them in the right kinds of roles that will allow them to flourish and to do the very best work of their lives.
I've thought that the care personally portion of the couple of tenets that you mentioned and challenge directly is the other one. I thought that the care personally one is so that you get openness from the person that you're giving candor to. So, for example, if they just feel like there's a heap of negative coming on them, they'll just close up and they'll wall off. But if they feel like it's, this person cares about me, wants to help me, is doing this with my best interest in mind, well, then it's much more easy for me to take that advice and guidance and to implement it without carrying around the baggage of feeling bad about it.
Well, I think that is a byproduct of caring personally, but it's not the purpose of caring personally. I think really at the very core of a person's ability to be a good leader is their ability to form real human relationships with the people who work directly for them. And often that relationship needs to come first. So even if you really need that person, if you can tell they've got, let's say, another offer that is going to take them a giant leap in the direction of their dreams, you don't try to hold them back. You try to help each person achieve their goals and achieve their dreams, even ahead of what you need from them. So you really do have to form these relationships in order to get the best out of people, and put those relationships at the center of what you do. It's not the feedback that's at the center of what you do, or the team that's at the center of what you do, or the results. Those, you're able to give feedback, you're able to solicit feedback, you're able to create a culture of feedback if you have good relationship with each of the people on your team. So those relationships are really central, and they are they don't serve some other purpose. You don't form relationships so that you can achieve results. Like, that's not really a real relationship. That's using people. The relationships have to sort of be at the core of what you do. Does that make sense as a distinction?
Yeah, I do think that's a distinction, and I agree. It is a byproduct, but allowing people to hear you is important. So it seems like an important byproduct.
A vital byproduct.
Yeah.
But again, you've got to the relationship is important for its own sake.
What about, so when I was kind of going down my list, we touched on honesty a little bit. If I think about self-awareness, I would think that if one is open and honest, but simply misguided, meaning that they were not necessarily self-aware, that would actually create more noise than signal. How is kind of self-awareness and kind of understanding where you are in context important to radical candor, or maybe it isn't?
It's vital. I mean, you've got to be radically candid with yourself as well as with others. I think that it's really, self-awareness is so important, but so difficult. And again, I'm going to come back to why the way you begin to build a culture of radical candor is by soliciting it. if you get other people telling you what they think, and you get a lot of other, you surround yourself with people who will hold up a mirror, that makes it so much easier to be self-aware. It's almost impossible, actually, to be all alone and self-aware. We actually rely on how we see ourselves reflected in other people's eyes for self-awareness. So I think, again, soliciting feedback is a really important part of self-awareness.
And one of the kind of many qualities that I touched on that I've heard you talk about before is humbleness. Now, this seems to be a common requirement for a bunch of the leaders that I've been talking to lately. Your thoughts on why humbleness are a requirement for radical candor?
Both being humble and being very confident. And I think actually, usually people who are humble are more self-confident than those who are incredibly arrogant. Because if you're really arrogant, it's your ego is very fragile. So part of the reason why being humble is so important is that when you go to give somebody feedback, you've got to realize that you may be wrong, and that's okay. And part of the feedback is a gift in one of two ways. When you go to criticize somebody, either you're right and you're going to help them fix a problem, or you're wrong, and by telling them what you think, you're giving them an opportunity to fix your misperception. And in order to go in, often when I start coaching people, they'll be reluctant to give feedback because they're not sure they're right. And I said, if you're sure you're right, you're going to give terrible feedback. You've got to go in with an open mind, and that's going to create a dialogue. And that's really what we're looking for here, is a dialogue between people.
Radical candor is a two-way street. Okay.
Absolutely.
So let's move to organizations for just a second. What are some of the telltale signs of an organization, particularly a startup, if you can think of any, that don't necessarily practice radical candor? What can happen?
A bunch of things happen. One is that projects that should be killed don't get killed, so you waste resources. You start to have meetings after the meeting or meetings before the meeting, and it's totally inefficient, and that feels to most people like being caught in traffic. You start to have political situations where people are going to leaders and talking badly about each other behind the back. And often inexperienced leaders will feel like they're being empathetic. So they'll listen to all this sort of backstabbing and try to play shuttle diplomat. And that just creates more politics. So you get people really kind of stewing in their own juices. And but the worst part of it is that people they cease to trust each other. They see things are going badly, but they can't quite admit it, and it becomes toxic. And in a startup, it gets toxic much, much faster because things are moving faster, and because it's a small number of people you're like stuck in a life raft together.
I also think it's because, a mistake gets so magnified in such a small group of people, and it can be so critical that people just tighten up.
Yes, you have a lot more life and death moments in a startup.
And so turning it on its head, what about the benefits to an organization that does practice radical candor? I was particularly thinking about, relative to corporate culture.
Yes. Well, you can practice radical candor in a big company as well as in a small company. So it's not dependent on the size of the organization, but the benefits are, number one, to me, the most important benefit is that going to work is more fun. You form good relationships. If something's wrong and you say it's wrong, you're not wasting your breath. People challenge each other to do the best work of their lives, and it's way more fun to do great work than to do mediocre work. There's more trust and respect between people, and you're more likely to succeed if you can tell each other when you're failing. And let's face it, it's more fun. It's no fun to fail. It's more fun to succeed than it is to fail.
Surely. What about hiring? are there ways to identify people who are more inclined to practice radical candor? Do you do that, or you just build it? You just teach it?
Well, you can teach it. I don't think that radical candor is an innate quality that people. In fact, I believe almost no qualities are innate. But anyway, so the way though to see if people are comfortable with it is to ask them about a time of failure. Ask them to criticize. Ask for some self-criticism, and see how open they are about mistakes they've made in their lives, and ask, when did they become aware of the mistake, and see how open they were to feedback from others, because there were probably people around them who were aware that they were making this mistake. Another thing that I will do sometimes is ask people to criticize something they've seen. If I'm interviewing somebody and they say they've read the book, I'll ask them to tell me about something they didn't like in the book. And it's amazing. Sometimes people are really honest, and I love it. I learned something about the book, and other times, not so much. And, I'm absolutely not going to hire them if they're not, because, again, I believe it can be taught. And also it's kind of a high stakes situation. I've put somebody in an interview to criticize a book I wrote. But it's a great sign when somebody's willing to do it.
By the way, that was my sly way of asking you what I should ask founders before I make an investment.
It's a really good question. I mean, now they're all going to know because you're making it public. But ask them about a time when they screwed up. Ask them about a time when they had to give feedback to somebody. Ask them about a time when they had to fire somebody, and how did they think about it? And did they do it? Did they do it well, or did they do it badly, like I did? And I describe in the book firing this poor guy who I called Bob, mostly, because I had failed to give him feedback over the course of several weeks.
So you're saying that you thought that, or you think that there's almost no innate qualities. They're mostly learned. I'm almost to the end here. I know you got to go. A couple of quick things. How can a leader improve their skill in this area? If this is learned, what should they be doing? Just like, personally, before they embark on this, what kind of lessons?
I think that some really simple things. Ask for feedback at the end of your one-on-ones, not at the beginning, but at the very end. Ask and just get in the habit of doing it. Make sure that you're giving feedback in impromptu 2-minute conversations, and make sure you're giving more praise than criticism. There's usually more going right than is going wrong, and so focus on the good stuff. Radical candor is not all about criticism. Praise is also really important. And again, this doesn't have to take a long time. It just takes a lot of emotional fortitude. So just have frequent conversations. You see something, you say something. To borrow a phrase from, I think, MTA in New York.
From the New York subway. That's exactly right.
Yeah, exactly.
That's like a New York shout out. How about that?
Yeah. New York is awesome for radical candor.
I think New Yorkers have a long-standing reputation for at least candor, I guess. Putting it all together, can you think of any case studies that you would refer people to go back and read or look at that illustrates the benefits of radical candor?
I tell a bunch of stories in the book about both Google and Apple. Both of them are very different cultures, but very successful cultures. And both of them I would describe as largely radically candid. Maybe Google is radical candor with a twist of ruinous empathy, and Apple is radical candor with a twist of obnoxious aggression. But they're both by and large pretty radically candid cultures. And I have a bunch of stories there. And also on our podcast, Russ Laraway, my co-founder, and I tell a bunch of stories from the Marines, from where I never was in the Marines, Russ was, and from early startups and from Russia about both radical candor successes and failures. So and I really believe in the power of storytelling. This stuff is so human, and it's easy to describe in abstractions, but it really comes to life when you read stories, I think.
So that was your sly plug for the book.
Yes, my very sly. Please buy the book. There's my less sly plug for the book.
I have one last prepared question.
Okay.
You, one of the pieces of advice that you've given to leaders is put your own oxygen mask on first.
Yes.
I personally think that's a good one, but just saying that, it's not necessarily self-explanatory. Why don't you explain that one to people?
So what I mean is that when you are exhausted, you're not doing your team or yourself any favors to push yourself beyond your limits. And so the most important thing that you do as a leader is to manage yourself well. So you got to figure out, what is it that you need in order to be at your very best? Do you need to get, I'll tell you what I need. I need to get 8 hours of sleep a night. I need to get an hour of exercise every day, and I need to have breakfast and dinner with my kids and my husband. And if I can do those things, it doesn't have to be 100% every single day, but most, 9 out of 10 days, I need to do those things. And if I can do them, then I'm fine, no matter what's going on. And if I can't do them, then I'm a disaster, even if things are going pretty well. So I'll give you an example. I have not been sleeping well lately. And just the other day, I canceled a lot of sort of high profile, important things I was supposed to do because I realized I have to sleep, or else I'm gonna drive myself and everybody else crazy. So you gotta put yourself first.
I like that story that you tell about running around the reservoir and who you ran into. So, yes. But I'm not gonna spoil that one. I'll let everyone go and find that one for themselves.
Awesome.
Okay. Let's see. I think we might have covered it, but I know repetition doesn't hurt. Want to give any web addresses where people find the book, podcast, all that info? Let's let people know.
RadicalCandor.com is the website. The book is called Radical Candor. You can get it anywhere you buy books, your local bookstore, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And the podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, is called Radical Candor.
The podcast is, I know there's a number of them out there, but it's only about less than a year old, right?
It's only 5 months old.
Yeah, start at the beginning of the year. That's what I thought. Okay. Let's end here. Thanks very much for your time and your insight. I really enjoyed it. Thanks. I think this is really helpful for a lot of different audiences.
Awesome. Great. Well, I'm sorry our time was short, but if you want to continue the conversation, happy to do it.
All right. Let's do it. Let's pick up again some other time then.
Okay. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thanks, Kim.
Take care.
This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glowy, who's been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode, and if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve BERG.